Not a place on the map, not a line on any briefing board, just a stretch of cold, empty sky over Germany where the odds of living through the next hour dropped off a cliff. You could feel it long before you got there. Engines droning, frost creeping across the windows, flak starting to blossom in ugly black puffs far ahead, and somewhere up there, out of sight for now, the Luftwaffe was waiting. At first, the mission sounded survivable on paper. The United States 8th Air Force would launch hundreds of bombers from England, nose toward the industrial heart of the Reich, smash ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and oil refineries, then fight its way home. Fighter cover would protect the formations, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings swarming around the big bombers like angry hornets. But every pilot and every gunner knew the catch. The fighters couldn't go the whole way. A P-47 had the fuel to get a few hundred miles into occupied Europe, maybe as far as Western Germany, before it had to turn back. The twin-engine P-38 could stretch a bit further, but not enough. Berlin, Munich, deep targets in Poland and Silesia, those were beyond escort range. Somewhere over enemy territory, always, the little friends would have to wave goodbye. And the Luftwaffe had timed that moment down to a science. Ask any bomber crewman what it felt like. 1 minute you've got sleek American fighters sliding along your wings, their pilots flashing a quick waggle before they peel away for home. The next minute, the sky feels huge and empty. You're still hours from the target. You're in enemy airspace. And you know that German fighters are already scrambling, forming up, getting altitude, waiting just ahead of your track. That's where the slaughter started. Luftwaffe group commanders had spent years perfecting the art of killing bombers. Head-on attacks at combined closing speeds over 600 miles per hour, 20 mm and 30 mm cannon shells walking straight through a fortress's nose. Diving passes from above, slicing through tight box formations and vanishing below before gunners could react. They didn't have to fight all day. They just had to hit the formations when they were naked inside the gap. The numbers were brutal. Crews needed 25 missions to finish a tour. Loss rates of 5–10% per mission turned that requirement into something close to a death sentence. Black Thursday over Schweinfurt, where entire groups were chewed to pieces, wasn't an outlier, it was a warning. Something had to change. More armor wouldn't fix it. More guns on the bombers wouldn't fix it. As long as that unescorted window existed, the Luftwaffe owned the sky over Germany. The solution wouldn't come from a new wonder weapon or a secret tactic. It would come from something that, at first glance, looked almost laughably simple: more fuel. To the veteran Luftwaffe aces of 1,943, the external tanks slung beneath the wings of the approaching P-51 Mustangs appeared not as a technological breakthrough but as an amateurish mistake. These men, decorated pilots with tallies in the dozens, saw only large, ungainly, teardrop-shaped cylinders hanging under the aircraft, disrupting the Mustang's sleek aerodynamic profile. From their perspective, this was a self-inflicted handicap. They believed the Americans had deliberately burdened their best escort fighter with excess weight, drag, and vulnerability. Around the tables of Luftwaffe officers' messes, these tanks became the subject of ridicule, nicknamed suicide bottles, symbols of what they interpreted as American desperation. Yet these first impressions, built on bravado and incomplete information, masked a deeper truth. The drop tank was about to transform the air war over Europe. The idea of an auxiliary discardable fuel tank was not new. Engineers had experimented with external tanks since the First World War, but turning the concept into something that truly functioned under operational wartime conditions proved far more difficult than theory suggested. A drop tank had to satisfy several demanding criteria simultaneously. It needed to be strong enough to withstand aerodynamic loads, temperature extremes, and structural vibration, light enough to avoid imposing unacceptable drag penalties, compatible with an aircraft's fuel system, and, above all, capable of being jettisoned instantly and reliably. A tank that failed to release could doom both pilot and aircraft if combat began before it emptied. Early Allied attempts were plagued by technical failures. Some leaked at high altitude, where temperatures could plunge to 40 degrees Celsius, causing seals to contract and fuel to congeal. Others produced so much aerodynamic drag that they negated their own range advantage. Many refused to release cleanly when the pilot activated the drop mechanism, Others detached prematurely, sometimes during takeoff roll, sometimes mid-flight. Fighter pilots, whose survival depended on readiness and maneuverability, viewed these early tanks with distrust and resentment. No pilot wanted to enter combat handicapped by unreliable equipment. The breakthrough came not from a single discovery, but from an evolution of design approaches pursued simultaneously in Britain and the United States. One solution was the pressed metal tank, steel sheets stamped into shape, welded together, and fitted with durable fuel lines and reliable fittings. These tanks were robust yet heavy and consumed critical industrial resources such as steel and skilled labor. The more radical approach, the one that drew the most skepticism, was the so-called paper tank. This term was misleading. These tanks were not made of simple paper, but of multiple layers of resin-impregnated craft fiber, molded under heat and pressure, then sealed with a specialized coating. The British referred to them as laminate tanks, but the nickname paper tank stuck. Early versions were unreliable, swelling in wet weather, leaking through improperly cured seams, and degrading under temperature changes. Yet the concept offered extraordinary advantages if perfected: low cost, low weight, rapid mass production, and freedom from reliance on critical metals. Every pound removed from the tank's empty weight translated directly into extended fighter range. Through rigorous experimentation, adjusting resin formulas, refining mold techniques, and improving coating materials, engineers eventually produced a version that held fuel reliably, maintained structural strength, and released properly. A 108-gallon paper tank for a Mustang weighed around 60 pounds empty. Its pressed metal equivalent approached 100. That difference, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and missions, was strategically decisive. By mid-1943, British and American factories were producing drop tanks in enormous quantities, tens of thousands per month. They came in several standardized capacities: 75, 108, and 150 gallons, each suited to different mission depths. At fighter bases throughout England, they accumulated in massive stacks, ready to be bolted onto Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings at a moment's notice. Yet the mere availability of the tanks did not guarantee their success. A significant obstacle remained: pilot acceptance. Fighter pilots were trained to prioritize maneuverability, speed, and offensive instincts. They had spent years refining the art of dogfighting, taught to trust the responsiveness of their aircraft, and to avoid unnecessary encumbrances. The idea of voluntarily flying into enemy territory with two large, fuel-filled containers dragging beneath the wings felt counterintuitive, if not outright dangerous. The Luftwaffe's propaganda capitalized on this anxiety. German radio broadcasts mocked the Americans, declaring that any pilot who relied on such gasoline bottles had already accepted defeat. They argued the tanks made American fighters slow and vulnerable, and that once the Germans engaged them, the Americans would be forced to drop the tanks, leaving them temporarily defenseless. Even within the 8th Air Force, some commanders doubted that fighters burdened with external tanks could adequately protect the bombers. Training flights in England appeared to confirm these fears. Pilots reported sluggish handling, degraded turn performance, and reduced acceleration. Many insisted that entering combat with the tanks still attached would be suicidal. What ultimately shifted opinion was a fundamental change in how fighter escort was conceptualized. The old doctrine held that escort fighters should remain close to the bombers at all times, flying predictable defensive patterns. But this allowed German fighters to choose when and where to attack, exploiting coverage gaps or using altitude and timing to neutralize American escorts. A new doctrine emerged among forward-thinking commanders. Fighters should not merely protect bombers, they should seek out and destroy the enemy. This meant aggressive patrols, offensive positioning, and proactive interception of German fighters before they reached the bomber stream. Dropping the tanks at the moment combat began was no longer seen as a hindrance, it became a feature of the strategy. The tanks existed to get the fighters into German airspace with the fuel to remain there for prolonged periods. Once emptied or once combat threatened, they were jettisoned, restoring the P-51's aerodynamic excellence. In this light, the drop tank was not a burden but the enabler of a new style of escort mission, one that projected American fighter power across the entire depth of the Reich. The Luftwaffe aces who had ridiculed the tanks had fundamentally misunderstood their purpose. They believed range was a secondary attribute. In reality, range was the strategic weapon that would allow American fighters to appear anywhere, at any altitude, at any moment, stripping the Luftwaffe of its geographic advantage. The drop tank, far from being a suicide bottle, was the quiet catalyst that allowed the P-51 to become not just an escort fighter, but the decisive instrument for dismantling Germany's air defenses. The true transformation of the air. War over Germany did not occur merely because Allied fighters could now escort bombers farther. It occurred because the very purpose of the escort fighter was redefined. Before the winter of 1943, American escort doctrine was simple but flawed. Fighters were to remain close to the bomber formations at all times, circling and weaving defensively to ward off German interceptors. The assumption was that the primary task of the escort was protection through proximity, yet this strategy ceded the initiative entirely to the Luftwaffe. German units could observe the bomber streams, calculate where the escort radius would end, and simply wait. They avoided the escorts when it suited them, conserving fuel and altitude, and only struck when they held every advantage. This predictable pattern ensured that no matter how skilled the American pilots were, their efforts were reactive. They blocked blows, but they rarely prevented them. Losses among the bomber groups reflected this limitation with disturbing consistency. The solution emerged not from technology alone, but from a fundamental rethinking of fighter employment, driven by a small number of commanders who understood that air superiority was not won defensively. One of the most influential voices was Colonel Hubert Hubb, Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group. He, along with leaders such as Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, argued that the role of escort fighters should shift from passive guardians to active hunters. Instead of merely shielding bombers, fighters should seek out German aircraft before they reach the bomber stream, disrupt their formations, destroy their experienced pilots, and impose relentless pressure on their home bases. The drop tank made this new doctrine possible. With extended range, Mustangs no longer needed to hover anxiously around the bombers, conserving every drop of fuel. They could strike first, patrol deep in enemy territory, and remain on station long enough to suppress multiple Luftwaffe sorties. The shift in philosophy was immediate and profound. Fighter groups received new mission briefings: protect the bombers until the attack run was complete, but once the bombers had left the target area, the fighters were authorized and later explicitly instructed to break away and hunt German fighters wherever they could find them. This initiative marked the beginning of offensive counter-air operations on a scale the Luftwaffe had never imagined. The Americans understood that their greatest asset was not just the Mustangs' performance, but their ability to dictate the terms of battle. The Luftwaffe's fighters, once able to pick the perfect engagement moment, suddenly found themselves reacting instead of initiating. They could no longer rely on climbing to altitude, executing head-on attacks, then breaking away towards safe airfields. With long-range escorts roaming across the Reich, even retreating became hazardous. The new doctrine also leveraged psychological and operational pressure. Pilots discovered that German fighter units were most vulnerable during two specific phases: takeoff and landing. During takeoff, aircraft were low, slow, and climbing with their landing gear still retracting a moment when they lacked maneuverability and situational awareness. On landing, pilots were tired, low on fuel, often damaged, and committed to a predictable descent path. The Americans recognized that by striking at these moments, they could inflict disproportionate losses with minimal risk. What followed was the rise of the fighter sweep and airfield busting tactics. Once the P-51 pilots had escorted the bombers through their withdrawal phase, they descended to lower altitudes and followed rail lines, roads, and rivers to locate Luftwaffe airfields. Approaching at high speed and low altitude, they raked runways, hangars, parked aircraft, fuel depots, and maintenance crews. They destroyed fighters that had not yet taken off, and they prowled the landing patterns waiting for returning German aircraft. Major Jörg Peter Hahne, a Luftwaffe ace, later wrote that by 1944, pilots feared the landing more than the combat itself, because American fighters so frequently ambushed them during their final approach. This systematic targeting of airfields was devastating because it attacked not just the machines, but the operational tempo of the Luftwaffe. Every destroyed aircraft represented thousands of manufacturing hours, Every strafed runway created delays that rippled through the entire defensive network. Every ambushed pilot represented months of training that Germany no longer had the resources to replace. Meanwhile, the Americans were refining their operational schedules. Where the Luftwaffe relied on short missions and rapid turnarounds near home bases, American fighters now had the endurance to loiter over enemy airspace for extended periods. They could wait for returning fighters, pursue units attempting to reform, or intercept reinforcements scrambled from secondary fields. This persistence shattered what little flexibility the Luftwaffe retained. Before the introduction of the drop tank, the Luftwaffe often flew multiple sorties per pilot per day, using their proximity to home airfields as an asset. Now, every takeoff and landing carried significant risk. This forced German commanders to disperse their aircraft across smaller, more remote airfields, and to rely on hasty camouflage and improvised defenses. But dispersal increased logistical strain, reduced unit coherence, and complicated pilot briefing and debriefing. American fighters were unaffected by these adaptations because the increased range granted by drop tanks meant they could reach even remote targets. The Luftwaffe also attempted to counter the new tactic by concentrating anti-aircraft guns around airfields. Yet the sheer number of American fighters in the air and their ability to approach from unexpected angles meant that defenses were rarely sufficient. American pilots adapted rapidly, learning to avoid pre-sighted flak traps, coordinate multi-angle attacks, and prioritize the most valuable targets. Over time, these fighter sweeps evolved into a daily ritual. Once the bombers cleared the target area, entire squadrons of Mustangs fanned out like predatory birds across Germany. They struck transport trains, maintenance convoys, radar stations, and fuel trucks. They disrupted communications, destroyed repair facilities, and attacked newly produced aircraft being transferred from factories to operational units. Their presence created a constant sense of exposure. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves engaging American fighters at high altitude, only to encounter different squadrons stalking their home airfields later the same day. Even if a German pilot escaped combat, there was never a guarantee that he would return to a safe landing environment. In effect, the Americans had transformed the Luftwaffe's homeland into a hostile battle space. The psychological impact was enormous. But when the Americans introduced long-range escort fighters equipped with reliable drop tanks, these structural advantages evaporated almost overnight. The Luftwaffe's reliance on short-range machine designs, on veteran pilots flying out of familiar home bases, and on operational cycles built around the idea that German airspace was fundamentally safe, became liabilities rather than strengths. This doctrinal shift, enabled entirely by the extended range provided by drop tanks, marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's unraveling. The numerical superiority of Allied aircraft mattered, the industrial strength of American production mattered, the improved training and rotation of US pilots mattered. Yet without the ability to impose continuous, offensive pressure deep inside enemy territory, none of these advantages could have been leveraged to their full potential. The drop tank allowed American fighters not only to escort bombers, but to dominate the sky on their own terms. It turned every German airfield into a potential battleground, every flight line into a target, every sortie into a gamble. In doing so, it transformed the P-51 Mustang from a mere escort fighter into the primary instrument of Luftwaffe attrition, a role it performed with precision, endurance, and relentless effect. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe faced a crisis far more profound than the loss of aircraft in combat. Its entire strategic foundation, its assumptions about geography, pilot experience, training capacity, and operational flexibility was collapsing. The core of this collapse lay in a miscalculation so subtle at first that few within the German command structure recognized it until it was too late. For years, the Luftwaffe had fought as a defensive air arm, relying on the proximity of home airfields, short flight times, rapid landings and refueling, and the ability to choose when and where to engage. These advantages had once allowed German fighter units to compensate for inferior numbers, rotating through multiple sorties per day while maintaining high levels of readiness. But when the Americans introduced long-range escort fighters equipped with reliable drop tanks, these structural advantages evaporated almost overnight. The Luftwaffe's reliance on short-range machine designs, on veteran pilots flying out of familiar home bases, and on operational cycles built around the idea that German airspace was fundamentally safe, became liabilities rather than strengths. The emergence of the P-51 Mustang as a true deep-strike escort fighter shattered the Luftwaffe's operating assumptions. Before 1944, Germany had invested heavily in building fighters optimized for high performance in short engagements, aircraft like the Bf-109G and the FW-190 Amperes. These were agile, powerful machines, ideal for climbing rapidly to intercept bombers, executing quick attacks, and then retreating to nearby airfields. Range was an afterthought. The Luftwaffe's belief that the war would be fought above German territory meant they saw no need to invest in fighters capable of hours-long operations or in large-scale production of drop tanks. Even when German engineers developed a functional 300-litre external tank, its use remained limited. German pilots distrusted external tanks for the same reasons American pilots initially did. They degraded performance during critical climb and maneuver phases. But unlike the Americans, the Germans never overcame this cultural resistance. As a result, their fighters remained tied to short-range operations, and their pilots entered battle with strict fuel constraints that limited their tactical options. The strategic implications became clear only when the Americans began to exploit their extended range systematically. With drop tanks, P-51 fighters could accompany bombers deep into the Reich, stay aloft long enough to fight multiple engagements, and still return safely. More importantly, they could remain in the air even after the bomber formations had withdrawn, using their remaining fuel to sweep airfields, attack returning German pilots, and disrupt the Luftwaffe's ability to recover from earlier engagements. German pilots described the change in stark terms. Before 1944, they could fly an interception, mission, land, refuel, and climb back into the fight with predictable rhythm. After the introduction of long-range escorts, this rhythm shattered. Airfields that had once served as reliable sanctuaries became dangerous environments. P-51 seconds loitered overhead, waiting for damaged or fuel-starved fighters to return. Once the P-51 pilots had escorted the bombers through their withdrawal phase, they descended to lower altitudes and followed rail lines, roads, and rivers to locate Luftwaffe airfields. Approaching at high speed and low altitude, they raked runways, hangars, parked aircraft, fuel depots, and maintenance crews. They destroyed fighters that had not yet taken off, and they prowled the landing patterns waiting for returning German aircraft. Diaries and post-war accounts describe a growing dread not of the enemy fighters encountered in formation, but of the sight of one's own runway, knowing that Mustangs might emerge at any moment from the cloud layer. It was this transformation, this destruction of sanctuary that most effectively unraveled the Luftwaffe. The collapse, however, was not merely tactical or psychological. With drop tanks, P-51 fighters could accompany bombers deep into the Reich, stay aloft long enough to fight multiple engagements, and still return safely. More importantly, they could remain in the air even after the bomber formations had withdrawn, using their remaining fuel to sweep airfields, attack returning German pilots, and disrupt the Luftwaffe's ability to recover from earlier engagements. German pilots described the change in stark terms. But as the war progressed, fuel shortages, Allied bombing of training facilities, and the diversion of skilled instructors to frontline units forced drastic reductions. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots often entered combat with fewer than 150 total flight hours, sometimes fewer than 50 inches operational fighter types. Many had received only cursory gunnery training and minimal time practicing combat maneuvers. This decline in training coincided tragically with the period in which American fighter presence was expanding most aggressively. Novice German pilots, already struggling with unfamiliar aircraft and insufficient preparation, now faced relentless, experienced American aviators who controlled the altitude, dictating every engagement on their own terms. The result was predictable: catastrophic pilot attrition. By the spring and summer of 1944, Germany was losing over 400 fighter pilots per month. Unlike aircraft losses, which could be replenished by expanding industrial production, pilot losses were irreplaceable. Each fallen veteran represented not just an individual but years of combat experience, teaching ability, leadership skill, and tactical intuition qualities that no crash program could replicate. Meanwhile, American pilots benefited from the opposite trend. Their training pipeline expanded, standardized, and improved. Their aircraft were consistently modern, plentiful, and maintained with exceptional logistical support. Their operational tempo was sustainable because they fought far from home, rotating through rest cycles and enjoying high levels of survivability. The Luftwaffe, increasingly facing enemies with greater experience and superior numbers, could not recover. Another devastating element was the impact of the American targeting strategy. The drop tank did not merely permit fighter escort. It enabled the Americans to transform almost every German airfield, aircraft factory, fuel depot, and maintenance hub into a potential target for low-altitude strafing or high-altitude interception. German aircraft production actually peaked in 1944, reaching unprecedented numbers over 3,000 fighters per month. Yet this industrial surge was effectively neutralized by the fact that thousands of newly produced aircraft were destroyed before they could ever be fully deployed. Strafing attacks annihilated aircraft during engine tests, taxi runs, or loading operations. Trains transporting new airframes to operational units were obliterated by roving fighter groups. Even delivery flights by factory test pilots became hazardous. The German leadership attempted to adapt. What looked like resilience in 1940, 1942 was in fact conditional dominance dependent on the limits of enemy reach. Once those limits disappeared, the entire system unraveled with accelerating speed. The collapse of the Luftwaffe in 1944, 1945 cannot be understood merely in terms of combat statistics or tactical shortcomings. It must be viewed through the broader lens of strategic attrition. But as the war progressed, fuel shortages, Allied bombing of training facilities, and the diversion of skilled instructors to frontline units forced drastic reductions. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots often entered combat with fewer than 150 total flight hours, sometimes fewer than 50 inches operational fighter types. Many had received only cursory gunnery training and minimal time practicing combat maneuvers. What looked like resilience in 1940, 1942 was in fact conditional dominance dependent on the limits of enemy reach. Once those limits disappeared, the entire system unraveled with accelerating speed. The collapse of the Luftwaffe in 1944, 1945 cannot be understood merely in terms of combat statistics or tactical shortcomings. It must be viewed through the broader lens of strategic attrition. Between January 1944 and May 1945, American fighters, primarily P-51 Mustangs, supported by P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds, claimed approximately 15,000 German aircraft destroyed, including roughly 10,000 inches the air and 5,000 on the ground. These numbers are staggering on their own, but their true significance lies in what they represent: the systematic dismantling of the Luftwaffe's capacity to function as a coherent fighting force. Under ordinary circumstances, an air force might survive catastrophic losses if it could rely on strong production capabilities, well-developed training systems, and strategic depth. Germany had none of these advantages by 1944. Its factories were increasingly dispersed and under constant bombardment. Its fuel reserves were evaporating. Its pool of experienced pilots had been drained by years of attrition, and its training pipeline had deteriorated to the point of producing underprepared airmen with almost no hope of surviving their first missions. Against this backdrop, the effect of American long-range escort fighters became decisive. The most immediate and quantifiable component was the loss of aircraft. Germany's aeronautical industry fought a losing but impressive battle to maintain production, reaching a peak output of over 3,000 fighters per month in late 1944. However, sheer quantity meant little when thousands of these aircraft never reached operational units. A significant share were destroyed on factory airfields, railway sidings, or dispersal strips before they ever saw combat. Long-range American fighter sweeps made possible only because of drop tanks turned every stage of the Luftwaffe's logistical system into a potential killing zone. Trains delivering new Bf 109 seconds and Flassing 190 seconds to frontline units were strafed. Test flights around factories were ambushed. Aircraft sitting on runways awaiting final checks were obliterated before their engines warmed. Even well-camouflaged dispersal areas could not guarantee protection. Mustangs simply waited aloft until movement revealed a target. This was the first layer of destruction: industrial attrition. The second layer, pilot attrition, was even more deadly. An aircraft could be replaced in weeks. A trained fighter pilot could not. Early war Luftwaffe training produced superb combat aviators, many of whom accumulated enormous kill totals during campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. But by 1944, Germany's ability to maintain this level of training had collapsed. Allied bombing disrupted flight schools. Fuel shortages meant trainees received only a fraction of the flight hours earlier generations had enjoyed. Experienced instructors were repeatedly pulled from training bases to replace combat casualties. As a result, new pilots were entering frontline units with dramatically reduced skills, often fewer than 150 total flight hours, sometimes barely competent even at takeoff and landing procedures. When these pilots met American fighter groups, whose members often had equal or greater experience and were flying technologically superior aircraft, the mismatch produced slaughter. Entire German squadrons were effectively wiped out in their first engagements. Survivors described their shock at encountering Mustangs that possessed altitude, speed, numerical advantage, and tactical initiative simultaneously, conditions that would have been unthinkable even 1 year earlier. This second-layer destruction of human capital was irreversible. Germany could rebuild planes, but not the experience of a Ritterkreuz-level ace. Yet even these two layers fail to fully capture the strategic picture. The third, and most devastating, component of the Luftwaffe's collapse was the loss of operational freedom. Prior to 1944, German fighter units retained the ability to dictate engagement terms. They could climb above bomber formations, attack at the most advantageous moment, disengage, refuel, and re-enter the fight in a structured, predictable cycle. Long-range Allied fighters obliterated this system. With drop tanks granting the P-51 extraordinary endurance, American pilots no longer protected bombers exclusively. They patrolled German airspace itself. As a result, Luftwaffe pilots could no longer rely on any safe phase of flight. Takeoff became perilous. Landing became perilous. Transit between fields became perilous. Climbing to altitude became perilous. Even moments of tactical success where a German pilot survived a dogfight or downed a bomber could end in disaster minutes later as Mustangs intercepted him while returning to base. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly emphasized in post-war accounts that, by mid-1944, they feared the landing pattern more than combat over targets. They described approaching their airfields exhausted, low on fuel, sometimes wounded only to receive radio warnings that American fighters were circling overhead. In these moments, they faced impossible decisions: attempt a landing and risk being shot apart, divert to a distant field with insufficient fuel, or bail out inside their own country. This unrelenting pressure destroyed morale and shattered the Luftwaffe's operational tempo. Units that once generated multiple sorties per day could barely manage one. Ground crews lived under constant threat of strafing. What looked like resilience in 1940, 1942 was in fact conditional dominance dependent on the limits of enemy reach. Once those limits disappeared, the entire system unraveled with accelerating speed. The collapse of the Luftwaffe in 1944, 1945 cannot be understood merely in terms of combat statistics or tactical shortcomings. It must be viewed through the broader lens of strategic attrition. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more in name than in reality. In many units, aircraft sat fully fueled with no pilots to fly them. In others, pilots were available but lacked fuel. Most operated at a fraction of their nominal strength. The Mustang, with its drop tanks, was not the only factor behind this collapse, but it was the indispensable catalyst. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more in name than in reality. In many units, aircraft sat fully fueled with no pilots to fly them. In others, pilots were available but lacked fuel. Most operated at a fraction of their nominal strength. The Mustang, with its drop tanks, was not the only factor behind this collapse, but it was the indispensable catalyst. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more in name than in reality. In many units, aircraft sat fully fueled with no pilots to fly them. In others, pilots were available but lacked fuel. Most operated at a fraction of their nominal strength. The Mustang, with its drop tanks, was not the only factor behind this collapse, but it was the indispensable catalyst. Instead, the combination of industrial precision, strategic persistence, and technological ingenuity produced a form of air superiority so complete that by early 1945, Allied transport planes could fly deep into Germany without carrying ammunition. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been reduced to a scattered, fuel-starved collection of grounded machines and inexperienced survivors, and the tool that enabled this transformation was not a new weapon, not a revolutionary aircraft, but a simple, mass-produced fuel tank that extended the reach of American fighters beyond every assumption the Luftwaffe had ever made.